Okay, we should be cooking with fire now. And if I can get some feedback from those who are on already. This is the fun part. Spoken somewhat facetiously. Okay. Boy, I sure hope you guys are hearing me. I'm just trying to get onto the page right now so I can... Okay, well, it says live now. Let's see if I can hear myself. Yeah, okay, good, I can. Kind of helps whenever I turn my sound on. Okay, so you can hear. Got something going on with my camera. I'm not sure what it is. So I wanted to give you guys a little preview into something I'm playing with. These little things are called Raspberry Pi. Now this particular one has a battery that's affixed to it here, and it's called a Pi juice. The idea is that these can do cameras as well, and I'm building out a camera. You attach this down onto a little device, a little plug right here, and then you set the camera up in the direction you want. That I'm going to make it my new camera, and we're going to see how that works. I've never done that as far as using it on YouTube like that, and there are some things that you need to consider, but I'm going to give it a shot, and I might actually make a video about it. But anyhow, that's so camera thing should be taken care of relatively soon. It might be kind of really nice to see a better camera, but let's see. So we are going to be talking today about Sukkot. This is the time of Sukkot, and bienvenido a todos. Gracias para venir. Thanks for coming, and we are, you can, okay, good deal. With fire, right? Excuse me. So we're talking about Chag HaSukkot, the festival of joy of the ingathering, or of the Sukkot. And I want to take a little bit different approach than maybe you have heard others take before. And if you guys have heard me for a while, then you have a rough idea what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to change my chair. Hang on a second. Hopefully it doesn't make too much noise. Sí, está mejor. Okay, so I want to start off this discussion with... what is Sukkot in its first tellings? Now, when we talk about Sukkot, there's I always tend to bring up textual criticism because within textual criticism, there's questions about whether or not something was written in the day or written after that time, and or introduced into an existing narrative that was prior. There's questions about that. Those who take a position that that all the text, or even just all of the Torah or whichever, is specifically stenographically translated, where God spoke and they wrote, or if it was something that was more God teaches you this, and then you go and you record it in pen form in your own way. But you're following an existing example that you were, given through some interaction between you and God. I tend to take the second opinion, that there are people that God has interacted with, and that those people have written down information either verbatim in some cases. It says you will write this, and that we tend to have to look at that more verbatim. But as a general rule, I believe that God interacts with humanity, and it is recorded through the person themselves who interacted, and not necessarily that God said you will write this, unless otherwise stated. And when we get to Deuteronomy, I think that Deuteronomy is our pinnacle of that. Number one, because it self-identifies as such, but also because it self-identifies itself as such as being the one that's written by the kings, and as far as what's read throughout the period of Sukkot, it was also what is self-identifies as being penned by Moses. And we see within that interaction that God does speak with Moses, interact with Moses, and then Moses, through his own, person, writes it out after the fact. Now, in that view, it opens the question. My dogs are free to run out right now, so they might get noisy. I apologize. In that view, we see that that Sukkot is given to the children of Israel, of those who were taken out of Egypt. So those who were taken out of Egypt come out of Egypt. They go off into the wilderness, and what are they taking? Well, generally, when you travel in those days, you traveled with tents. Light poles that were strong, light covering which could protect from wind and rain, which was light and strong, and that this is what was used when you traveled. And if you didn't have that, you made do with what you had. But the idea was strong poles and a cover. Now, we call that a tent. But that's as a general rule, that was what was used during travel. When a period happened where you stayed for a longer time frame, or for an extended stay within a certain area, then you would build a more permanent structure according to your climate and your environment. This is normal. This is how people normally do things. And it's reasonable to expect that they would do this. Matter of fact, I forgot to do that. Hi, how are you? ¿Cómo le va? Seeing me is no better than hearing me, I guess. And really it's not. So anyhow, when we talk about Sukkot, we're talking about it really, at least from the perspective of Deuteronomy, as a memorial for the children. I know that there's record of it in Exodus and so forth, but I believe that is something somewhat anachronistic, not necessarily a commandment for that time. Because when you look at Exodus and Leviticus, they're traveling up to Kadesh Barnea. During that time, it would have been impractical to carry around sukkah. Sukkah is a semi-permanent dwelling. A tent, four strong sticks and a covering, that's what you normally traveled with. That seems to be what is expected from all the things that were taken from Egypt. They looted Egypt, right? Well, what did they take? Sukkah, they took palm leaves. Palm leaves aren't something that you just pick up off the ground in this area of the world. Not that palms don't grow, but they grow at oases. So it takes a lot of oases to cover the number of people that people think walked out of Egypt. So it is not reasonable to expect that they came out of Egypt with sukkah. They came out with tents because they had material. They looted Egypt of material. It is far easier to expect what they left with was basically a bunch of tents and not Sukkot. So when we get to the time where they're at the mountain, now we have Sukkot because they're staying in this place for a year. They're going to be there for a full year. Before that time, it doesn't seem like it's needed because they're traveling every single day, and it seems to be a reference that the cloud over them protected them and may have been their tent for them. However, keep in mind, they did leave Egypt with wagons and with material. So wagons and material means they have wood and cloth. That is a tent, and that's something that every single one of them would have had. When we get to the extended period of time at the mountain, which was a year, it is reasonable to expect that by that time there were some more permanent dwellings that were being constructed. And when they get up after that year and move on to Kadesh Barnea, then at that point we see they have a 38-year vacation at the door of the land, and they're not allowed to enter. And during that time is where they develop semi-permanent dwellings. These dwellings would be something that could handle the rain, the wind, the cold. Because remember, they're supposed to go in, and when they go to have this entrance into the land, and they are stopped by this, from that point on, they're going to dwell there the entire year. This is even more north than where they were before, so it's going to be colder. There's going to be different temperatures they deal with. The permanent dwellings will be more like what they had in Egypt. They would be permanent dwellings. That's where we get Sukkah from. This is a perspective that not everyone agrees with, but this is something that I find reasonable. And so when the children in Deuteronomy 16 are actually told to perform the Sukkot, that it's a memorial for a promise that was made to the fathers before them. And because that seems to be the purpose behind this memorial, is that there is a promise that was given to the fathers that they would enter the land. They, through rebellion, were not allowed to stay in the land, and their children were promised to be restored to the land in their place. When we get to Deuteronomy, where he's speaking to the children who are coming back into the land, he tells them, and we see this in Deuteronomy 28. In Deuteronomy 28, we go and we, let's see. Well, I'll just do this and go back. We see that they're going to be done again, that the same thing as their fathers, they're going to be removed from the land and sent out into the nations, and they will be sent and scattered throughout all the peoples. And then it says, but your children, I shall restore them. Now, the promise that was given to the children, which was not given to the fathers before them, is this. Now, I may have just lost everybody with that sudden U-turn, but let me back up a second. The promise to the fathers that came out of Egypt were that they were going to enter into the land. Through rebellion, they were not allowed to enter into the land, and God said, I will bring your children into the land. In the promise that is given to the children is that I will bring you into the land. You will enter into the land. Joshua will lead you. And as you enter the land, these are the laws you will obey. And if you do not, then, chapter 28, I will remove you from the land and send you out of the land. But in chapter 30, it says, but when that happens, now this is the same thing that happened with the fathers before them. They came to Kadesh Barnea. They were supposed to enter the land. They didn't, and they had to linger in the wilderness outside of the land, outside of the promises and the blessings that were going to be given to them once they entered the land, and that during that time, God remembered. And it was their children after them that were going to be restored, and the children after them, who's being told this story now, in our day, are those who are still future, that God will gather them and will bring them back into the land. But the difference is that thou and thy children, this is a new promise that was given to the children, and it seems to be absolutely fine. And if there's ever such thing as progressive revelation, we see an example of it right here, but it's extremely limited. In this case, this promise, which is different than the promise that Sukkot is a memorial of, this promise is that not only will our children be the ones that enter into the land, but you and your children, which gives us this idea of a continuity, that it's not just worrying about the day when this happens. Those kids of ours are going to be the blessed ones. We're sucking in the hind quarters of the earth now, and that we have no hope because it's only our children. This is the portion of the promise that we are sitting under, and that Sukkot is supposed to remind us of. This is the portion of it which gives us ha-tikva, the hope. is that not only our children this time, but also us. Because the lesson that we are memorializing Sukkot with is that our fathers could not enter, did not. It was only the children in this day at Deuteronomy that he was speaking to, that only they were going to enter in because their fathers before them had removed themselves from the covenant. The promise in the future is that not only the children, but also thou. The only thing that makes sense to me is that thou is non-temporal. Every person who brings their hearts back to this covenant, I command you here today, to hearken to his voice according to all that I command you this day. Deuteronomy, not Exodus, not Leviticus, not Numbers, but Deuteronomy, is that when we turn our hearts back, hearken to his voice. What that means is open for interpretation. What level of obedience is required in order for God to consider that? We'd have to work for a common denominator and go from the lowest possible threshold, which is a Christian idea. The idea within Judaism, I think, is a far better idea, and that is that anybody who changes any aspect of their life, regardless how pious or impious they are, as long as the hearken to return to this makes a change, then they have reached that minimum threshold. And I tend to agree with that, because anything more is assumption. The most basic assumption that you can make that would be reasonable is that anyone who would change any aspect of their life to these words, because it's unique from everything else everybody else is doing, if you convert your mind to this, then you have achieved what this promise allays to. That's the way I read this. And again, not just because not just the children, but also those who turn their hearts back, and the children. They're the ones who are going to be gathered back. So that's the hope. Sukkot is supposed to be this reminder, and the way I view this, in a reminder that God will bring the children back, and that he did it once. He showed the promise is real, and he showed that he will keep his promise, in that the children did enter in. And then the children were told, you're going to do the same thing. God is going to make a promise, and this promise is that not only the children this time, but every person until that day who turns their hearts and hearkens back. This is what I believe the promise is, that for Sukkot today. I believe that that Judaism and Proto-Judaism, as far as like Ezraic onward until we get to the Tanaim, that even Proto-Judaism supports this idea, in that they were looking for the same basic thing. Now let's talk about that. When we get to Solomon, hang on, it's in one of these windows. Oh, it's right here. There we are. Oh, I'm not hitting the right one. Okay, I don't have the right one up, so I'm going to do it from memory. I apologize. Solomon, his introduction of the first temple, of the Temple of David, of the Temple of Solomon, his introduction happens during the time of Sukkot. It was a turning point in Torah history, in the way I view things. In that God told us to, in Deuteronomy specifically, he told us to take the tabernacle and plant it underneath or beneath or at the foot of the mountains of Ebal and Gerizim. That place was Shiloh, and Shechem was not far from there. And that they were to plant the place there, and they were to set up an altar there, and this was the place that he placed his name. And we get the golden age of David, which boiled down to its most common elements, is that David, through military might and through the bloodshed of his brothers, brought the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom together as one. Then continued that routing of the northern identity, and removed from them the tabernacle and placed it in his land in Jerusalem, and then had his son, mighty edifice in the name of God at this place, and he makes the presentation of this on Sukkot. He introduced a new era of Torah, which, like I said, I'm not saying that it wasn't authorized, and I'm not saying it was authorized at this particular moment. I'm saying that that is the first major diversion from a Deuteronomistic Torah, and it happened at Sukkot. When we get to the next major turning point in the presence of Torah in this world, it happens during the days of Ezra. Ezra, who opens up his temple after the destruction of Solomon's temple, and after there's a quite elaborate explanation of God removing himself from the tabernacle of Solomon, or the temple of Solomon, in Ezekiel chapter 10, that Ezra proceeds to introduce this new temple with great fanfare, and God does not return. He doesn't come and do the same thing he does in the days of Solomon, but that is the mark of the next change in Torah, in the presence of Torah in the earth, on the earth. This change resulted in basically this second temple, which stood in the same place as the first temple, roughly, and that this temple is what brought about a great deal of messianism that expected someone to come and fill the throne. So keep in mind, we have David, who brought about the change of the tabernacle to the temple, David being the king and his son Solomon being the king, and then the age of kings that followed up until the great kings of Hezekiah and Josiah. These all happened because of the temple. So 500 years before the times of Herod and Jesus, 500 years before that, Ezra on Sukkot brings about a restored temple, and Micah and these others proclaim that God is bringing the restoration now. So they wanted Micah and the others, Habakkuk and these others, they wanted them to be right. They wanted them to be telling the truth, because they wanted a Messiah back. Because David was the Messiah. Solomon was the Messiah. Messiah meant king. It meant anointed one. It could also be used for high priest, king of the priests, king of the land. Those two positions were anointed. Cyrus, a king of his land, was also anointed. People read it out of context and think that God anointed Cyrus. No, Cyrus was anointed. That's what the term means. So when God says, Cyrus my anointed, it's not Cyrus, I anointed you to be king. It's Cyrus, you are an anointed one. I am using you. My takes possession. That's really all it's saying. We take it to mean that God has some personal investment in Cyrus. We see some of that with Nebuchadnezzar, and we see that with several other of the interactions with the handwriting on the wall, and with the judgment of the band on the root of the tree, and the turning into an eagle or a griffin or whatever, or Jonah being told to go speak to Nineveh. These are all examples of God in Egypt. God taking possession of Pharaoh, not possession, but making Pharaoh move in a way that was not necessarily a choice that Pharaoh would have made on his own. And that takes possession. And we said, Cyrus, my anointed, it's really all it's defining. It's God used him for something. He was an anointed. He was a king in his land. Messiah is just king, or king of the priests, or whatever. So when we talk about the messianic fervor that has developed in the days of the Greek and the I cannot remember the name, the Maccabean times of the revolt, that when we get to that time, there's an expectation that there's going to be a king. I mean, because here we've had a couple hundred years and there's still no king. Well, what happens? Well, this guy named Alexander Janai, he's basically given great robes of purple and crowns of gold and set up as the high priest to lead the people of the land. And he's to be the high priest of the people. And now the Hasmonean, that's the word I was looking for, they set him up, just like Herod. They set this guy up as this high priest, and he stands at the altar and he gets ready to do his offering. Well, what happens? The entire population pelt him with lemons, with etrog, or esrog, depending on where you're from. But, pelted him with lemons. By the way, that story became a story throughout Judaism as interesting enough. But anyhow, this was a messianic presentation of a change where now you have a king. He's been set up by the Greeks, but now you have a king. Well, that's what led to the Maccabean revolt. That began because someone was stood up at Sukkot to identify a leader for the people to follow from the perspective of, in the case of the Hasmoneans, to be subjugated to them. In the case of Herod, it would be for Rome. But we also have, so it by the time we get to the time of the Roman occupation, the idea that the Messiah stands at Sukkot and makes the proclamation was very much an expected thing. I mean, look at Zechariah here. What does it say about Zechariah? And it shall come to pass, every one of the nations that are left, okay, Zechariah, late prophet. So when it talks about wars and battles of nations that come against Jerusalem, these guys are writing about things that are happening. It's this during the Hasmonean period. Greece had already the Hasmoneans, or the Greeks before them, had already been an influence on the land, and it's just building day by day by day. Obviously, this culminates in the Roman occupation, which destroys Israel. But when Zechariah's day, he's talking about actual tensions that are going on in the land, and he's proclaiming what's going to happen. Do I think God spoke with Zechariah? Actually, no, I think Zechariah is writing a first-person commentary from somebody who believes they have a good understanding of what Moses and the prophets before him have said, and he's trying to speak something to Jerusalem to tell them what to expect. And in that, we see in the author's expectation that at Sukkot, all the nation is going to come and worship God at Jerusalem, and that Jerusalem will be restored. And honestly, there's no mention of Israel here. I mean, from the author's perspective in Zechariah, this is only about Jerusalem and Judah, which tells me this is, again, post-Babylonian homily to the people to tell them that after and even after the Ezraic temple has been built, is that God hasn't come, God will come. Don't worry, this is what to expect, and it'll happen around Sukkot, because when Sukkot happens, the nations will be coming to bow down and pledge their fealty. So that's the expectation in the days of Zechariah. You go a couple hundred years later, and you get to the time of Herod and Jesus. So what happens during that day? Jesus goes when? He goes during the festival. Which festival? Well, you look back up here, textual criticism and grammatical, historical, contextual study works in the New Testament just as well. It says, at the festival of the Yehudim was near, the festival of Sukkot. So, here we are at the festival of Sukkot, and the Yehudim are there. Why? The Yehudim are there looking for him. His brother said to him, hey, Yeshua, get away from here and go into Yehuda, so that your taught ones will see your works that you're doing. They wanted him to go to the Yehudim to teach them, because the Yehudim are the ones that have to give their seal of approval in that day. All these guys that he's talking to, that Yeshua is talking to, are the commoner, the pew. And the pew are saying, hey, go talk to the Yehudim. You have to convince them. If you can convince them, then everything is going to be great. And this is what's told to Yeshua by his fellows. Get away from here. Leave here. Go to Yehuda. Go into Yehuda so that your taught ones also see the works that you're doing. Go share your word there. Well, what's the answer? No, because it says, let's see, for no one acts in secret. Even his brothers did not believe in him. Because why? He wouldn't go to the Yehudim. Therefore, my time has not yet come, but your time is always ready. Some of these things you don't know how to make it make sense, but it is possible for the world to hate you because it hates me, so forth, so on. But here's the deal. It's about the festival. He's going to the festival. So the Yehudim, therefore, were seeking him at the festival. So they want him to go to the festival. They want him to go to the Yehudim and to teach there in the festival to not only to the Yehudim, but also the taught ones, the ones that were already following his message. And he wants to go there and to teach them openly. But when his brothers had gone up to the festival, he also went up, but not openly, but as it were in secret. So what happened? The Yehudim are searching for him in the crowd of those who are known associates kind of thing, saying, where is he? And there was much grumbling about him amongst the crowd. Some were saying, he's a good guy. Others are saying, no, but he's leading the crowd astray. So this is the discussion going in amongst the crowd. So there's a fervor up about listening to this guy. Everybody wants to hear this guy. So this guy has chosen to come and speak on Sukkot, and he's going to be speaking a message that changes the direction of Torah. One of the things that had happened up to this time is they started doing what's called a water libation. The water libation is a late invention. It's something that you can find throughout the archaeology, as far as in the pre-Talmudic documents, back when you get to Josephus and so forth. They refer to the water libation being something that was integrated into the temple service as a way of praying and asking God for water and rain for the coming year. And that there was a whole service that went over about it. Matter of fact, it was Josephus that talks about the Alexander Janai or whatever his name was, that stood in and was making the offering that the people pelted him with etrogs. Well, there's a story within the Talmud that there's a story that existed before that it refers to, that someone had poured the water from the water libation onto their shoes, and the crowd pelted them with etrogs, and that this shows a literary understanding of the previous story, if not a complete abrogation of the original story to plagiarize a new story, to create a new story. Excuse me. But here we see that Yeshua has come, and the crowd is expecting a motivational speech of some type. They want to hear what he has to say. Some of the crowd is saying, no, he's misleading the crowd. Who were the ones who said that? Could have been Yehudim. The Yehudim were the ones that were trying to close this down. The Yehudim in this particular type of text are what we would call proto-Jews. The Jews of that day, Pharisees and Sadducees, mainly Pharisees. Matter of fact, if you are a Pharisee, you are a Jew. If you are a Jew, you could be a Sadducee. But if you are a Pharisee, you are a Jew. Anyhow, so in the middle of the festival, back up. But no one spoke openly about him. So here's the conversation openly. They were saying he's good, and others were saying he's misleading the crowd. But none of them spoke publicly, what got up in front of the people and calmed them to choose one, he is good, or the other, he is leading people astray. No one is doing that because they fear the Yehudim. So that's what's going on here. Then, about the middle of the festival, 3 days into it or so, Yeshua goes up into the set-apart place, and he was teaching. Where is he at? Solomon's porch is probably the most likely, because you just don't walk into the temple, because who are you going to teach? 20, 30 people maybe? Because the area you could walk into in the temple isn't going to be enormous. where if there's going to be a lot of people here listening to this, it's going to be at Solomon's porch, which is part of the temple complex in Herod's day. And that if that's a set-apart place, most likely it is, then he would be making a proclamation to the public that is yearning to hear him, and he has chosen a specific time noted for its, in that day, messianic expectation. And this is how the crowd responds. Remember, we started out that that Sukkot in the first generation wasn't something that was commanded for them to do. It was just something that they grew into, as per the way Sukkot is used versus a tent. They come out of Egypt with tents. They parked themselves in Kadesh Barnea for 38 years in exile when they had sukkahs. Taking that perspective, then the children, their promise is that God will protect the promise that he makes to them, that their children will inherit the land just like they are inheriting the land from their fathers who lived in Sukkot. So you will take and live in sukkahs as a remembrance of that, to teach that in the day when you go into exile, that God will bring you back. So the beginning of this is a promise that God will bring back the children. That seems to be what's directly related to the practice of Sukkot. When we get to Solomon, the big change at Sukkot, it's the announcement of messianic fulfillment of a prophecy they didn't know they had. And that is that God changes the tabernacle to the temple from Shiloh to Jerusalem. The next expected prophecy is in Ezra, where the temple is rebuilt, the people are back from the land, but God never visits. And from that moment on, the expectation of God establishing the Messiah becomes the main portion of the event. By the time we get to Yeshua's time, we see that it is in high swing in their day at the same time of year at Sukkot. And Yeshua is choosing, for whatever reason, to make his public announcement to the world, because that's what Sukkot is about, is that the entire nation is gathered there in one place, and he is making a singular proclamation for the first time in his ministry to all of the nation at one time. So, and he does it at Sukkot. This is a messianic fulfillment in the eyes of the post-exilic Israel. Because again, the messianic element of Ezra's temple was never realized, and they had looked for it multiple times, even in the days of the Maccabean revolt. It was in high swing in the days of Yeshua, and in that day, Yeshua is making an announcement at Sukkot in the middle of the festival, and he's doing it just before the water libation festival happens, and he does it by attributing, what you learn from me is more important than the water at the temple, because what you learn from me will bring living water from within. And that's the message he brings. So he's changing the flow of the Torah to no longer be temple bound, because up to this point there has been great expectations that the temple of Ezra was going to be the restoration of Israel. I mean, read Micah. That's a great example of what I'm saying. He had great expectations of the messianic age beginning in his day, and that God was bringing these things to happen. Well, it didn't. And that expectation is fulfilled in Yeshua, who brings along the message that it's not about the temple, it's about us. Because the temple for 500 years hasn't brought us squat. And here we are under the thumb of Rome. So Yeshua is bringing an answer to why God hasn't fulfilled the messianic part of the temple of Ezra. So here we see, in the days of Yeshua, he's saying, it's not about the temple. Obviously, we've been waiting 500 years. It's not about the temple. It's about us. And this is the message I have for you. That we aren't to wait for the Messiah to fill this temple. We are waiting for the Messiah to fill this temple. And then from there, God will gather us back. That's the message that Yeshua brings, not as a fulfillment to anything Moses said, but as a fulfillment to what didn't happen in the days of Ezra. Because before that time, the messianic aspect of Sukkot wasn't an issue. It was just something that happened. During Solomon's day at Sukkot, he announced his, position as king and the man of God, God with us, and that he moved the temple service to here without authority from text, and then proclaimed that God filled the tabernacle, filled the temple, and anointed the offering with the fire from heaven, and sealed that this decision was acceptable in his eyes. Well, Ezra didn't have that. No such luxury for Ezra. And that expectation is what began the messianic fervor that led us to hear Yeshua at the high time of messianic expectation. During this time, we see Rome is literally fed up with the number of revolts that's been going on since well before Greece. And the Roman rule over the people is becoming more and more of an issue because of these zealot groups who were causing a lot of trouble. So there's a lot of tension, huge fervor for a messianic fulfillment, just like every year. And Yeshua, who for a couple years has been talked about, and all of a sudden he's here, he's going to speak now. Everybody wants to know what's going on. Some of them think he's going to be a good speaker. Some of them think he's going to be a bad speaker. But no one wants to, proclaim their vote on either side because they're afraid of the Yehudim, who are directly challenged because the Yehudim require the temple and require that focus of the nation and require this obedience to the temple in order for all of their work to be given justification and authority in the eyes of the people. So we have two competing religions happening. And this is why the Yehudim are involved. This is why the Yehudim wanted to shut him up. Not because he was God, but because he was making a messianic proclamation that was gathering momentum in the eyes of the people, because at this festival there was much grumbling, much. So it wasn't just a couple people in the crowd saying, "Have you heard about Jesus? Where are you going to go when you die?" This is what was happening. There was discussion amongst groups of people that were affecting the crowd. So this is not a small thing. There was a lot of expectation to hear this guy speak in particular. So this guy was a direct threat. Now, again, we could talk about, my teaching is not mine, but him who sent me. He didn't say he was sent by God. What he does say is he didn't come up with it on his own. He was taught this. This is something people really misuse this. In the middle of the festival, he goes up to the set-apart place and he was teaching, and the Yehudim were marveling, saying, "How does this man know letters, having not learned?" Isn't that how Christians say that? How can this guy know the Torah? He hasn't learned it from a shul. He hasn't learned it from the rabbis. How could this guy know Torah so well? This is how Christianity taught me to read that. But if you read it in a different context, it's the Yehudim are marveling. They're railing on him, saying, "Why is this guy talking about Hebrew? He doesn't know Hebrew." This is how we would say it today. But what they're saying is, how can this guy be giving you fulfillments of oral Torah and tradition, or giving you commandments from oral Torah and tradition without having any proper training? So what he's telling you isn't important because it's not part of the context. He's making up his own context. This is kind of how I'm reading this. Not that they were marveling that, man, this guy knows Torah so good and no one's ever taught him. But rather saying, look at this idiot. He's trying to teach you Torah and he has no idea what he's talking about. That's how I'm viewing this. Why do you say that, Jeff? Because his answer. His answer is, I didn't come up with this on my own. Someone taught me this. Doesn't say who. But he says, someone taught me this. I didn't come up with this on my own. That's his response to this comment. And the marveling wasn't them saying to themselves, oh my goodness, look how smart this guy is. No, their marveling was something that he heard and understood and then responded to. And what they marveled was, how is it you can stand there and say these things? You have never learned anything from the right source, from the proper outlet. Well, he goes and says, my teaching is not mine. I didn't come up with this on my own. We hear this in whenever we get on these social media discussion boards and stuff like that. We hear it all the time. You know, I didn't come up with this. This is the Holy Spirit. And, you know, this is the same idea. He's answering and saying, I didn't come up with this on my own. This is something that I was taught. And the one who taught me, I know what he says. If anyone desires to do the one who taught me his desire, he shall be known concerning the teaching. And once you desire to follow those and you learn what the teaching is, then you'll know whether it's from God or whether he just came up with it on his own. So he's not saying, people read this as coming in from a completely different context. But he's saying, I didn't come up with this on my own. I was taught this. If you desire to learn what I was taught, then learn it. And you'll know concerning the teaching whether it did come from God or whether I just came up with it on my own. This is how we're supposed to judge prophets in general, right? We're supposed to know what they're teaching, to know whether it is from God or whether he came up with it on his own. I do that with Deuteronomy. When it says, you know, you don't change these words, and I use it that very same way. I can use John 7:17 almost exactly like I do use Deuteronomy as a whole, and my reasoning would be something that Jesus could be expected to say in today's language here in John 7:17. That, you know, you study it out. Read it for yourself. Understand what it says, and you decide if it's from God or if I'm just coming up with it on my own. That seems to be all he's saying. He who speaks of himself seeks his own esteem. The people who come up with this stuff and say, no, you know, God told me or whatever, you know, they're seeking their own esteem. And those who but he who seeks the esteem of the one who taught him is true, because he's teaching you. I'm teaching you what I believe to be true. I'm seeking not my esteem, because I don't say I come up with it on my own. I'm just trying to point you to where I get it from, and you decide whether it's from God or not. If it's from myself, I'm just speaking my own esteem. But if it's of God, then I'm not seeking my esteem. I'm following in the esteem of the one who taught me. The one who sent him is true. The one who taught him. So I'm seeking esteem of the one who taught me, because I believe this is true. This is how I'm reading it. People can say, well, I don't understand that. Well, that's because sometimes I have a hard time explaining myself. But he goes on to say, did Moses not give you the Torah? So he's saying he learned it. Test whether it's of God. It's not. If it's of me, it's only me seeking my esteem. If it's not of me, it's of the one who sent us or taught us. He immediately says, didn't Moses give you the Torah? So the first thing he responds to here is that this is based on Torah. The one who sent, whether it's of God or not, didn't Moses give you the Torah? What's the next thing he says? Yet you guys don't know Torah. So Jesus is kind of like any one of us today who's railing against Judaism. In this case, he was railing against proto-Judaism. In the case today, the railing is completely different. In my case, I don't rail against them. I just know that those are traditions. I just disagree with the oral aspect of it. I assume Jesus, in this case here, is disagreeing with the oral aspect of it as well. But he says, didn't Moses give you the Torah? You can see whether what I'm teaching you is from God. You've got the Torah. Go look it up. Yet you don't do the Torah. Why do you seek to kill me? Well, that seems to be an odd thing to question when he just told them they don't keep Torah, which is directly challenging the Yehudim, who need the rabbinic, the Pharisaic the proto-Judaism of the day needed it to maintain its force. He's basically challenged him directly in the front of the crowd from the entire nation gathered together at Sukkot. Then the crowd, who sees all this, answers and says, "You have a demon. Who seeks to kill you?" He's talking to the Jews here, the Yehudim here. The Yehudim marvel, how does this man know this? My teaching is not my own. He's answering them. He's answering the Yehudim all the way down to here. The crowd answers because they don't know he's talking to the Yehudim, apparently. And then he answers and talks about, circumcision, blah, 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 blah. The reason I'm saying blah, 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 because I'm getting to something else. Therefore, some of them from Jerusalem said. So after all of this comment that he makes, the slam that he gives to the Yehudim, the answer to the crowd that he gives to them here, the next thing that happens is in the midst of the festival, some of them from Jerusalem said, "Is this not whom they are seeking to kill? And see, he speaks boldly." This is the key. "And see, he speaks boldly, and they say none at all to him." They, who's they? The Yehudim. So Yeshua speaks boldly, and the Yehudim aren't answering him. For whatever reason, dumbfounded, maybe he just stumped them with his words. But for whatever reason, they didn't respond. We see down here, okay, and the officer said, "Never has a man spoke like this." So this answer is given on the second attempt. But up here, it seems to be that some of them said, "Isn't this the guy they're seeking to kill? And see, he speaks boldly," but they say nothing. So you'd assume that, taking us back down here, it's, we've never heard anybody speak like this before. So there could be some overlap in the story. Could it be that the rulers truly know that this is the Messiah? Okay, so now we have, for the first time in several years, because it hadn't happened in a while, it did happen in Egypt several years before this as well, but not at Sukkot, not in the temple, on the temple grounds. This is absolutely fulfilling every expectation of a messianic fulfillment in their eyes, because this guy has caused the entire nation to question him, to talk about him. He was a subject of discussion across enough of the crowds to be considered a swath of those who were active in Sukkot, active in the temple, active in the processes, knew about him day after day after day, because on the second, on the third, and the fourth day, even on on the last day, we see that he is interacting with the crowds. This is fulfilling messianic expectations in that day. And the people are saying, he's talking, the rabbis ain't stopping him. They weren't rabbis, they were Pharisees. The Pharisees aren't stopping him. So could it be that the Pharisees truly know that this is the Messiah? So this is what the people start to think because of the inaction of the Pharisees. Because we know where this one is from. We know where Yeshua is from. He's from Nazareth. And when the Messiah comes, no one knows where he's from. So they say that we know where this guy's from. We're not supposed to know where the Messiah comes from. So they're saying this is the Messiah. But wait a minute. We know where he's from. The Messiah that we're supposed to be waiting for, we don't know. So there's an expectation that's being spoken about openly here. See, he speaks boldly, and they say none at all to him. Could it be that the rulers know that this truly is the Messiah? But we know where the Messiah is from. And when the Messiah comes, no one knows where he's from. Yeshua therefore answered them and said, "You both know me, and you know where I'm from. And I have not come of myself. I was sent." I did not come up with this. I was sent. This is saying that he's not Messiah. But wait. "But I know him because I am from him, and he sent me." So he's saying that the Messiah sent him. So this is how he answers the people, which is odd, right? He answers the people and says, wait a minute, you guys know where I'm from. But the one who sent me, the one he says, my teaching is not mine, but he who sent me, do his desire. You'll know it's from God, and you'll know if it's from me. You'll know which one. You have the Torah, don't you? You don't follow the Torah. And he goes and says, him that sent me is the one who is the Messiah. So they were seeking to seize him, but no one laid hands on him because his hour had not yet come. What do you mean his hour had not yet come? And see, he speaks boldly, and they say nothing to him. They were seeking to seize him, but no one has laid hands on him. The people are saying this because the people are talking. See, he speaks boldly, and they don't do anything. They were seeking to seize him, but they didn't lay hands on him because his hour had not yet come to be lifted up as Messiah. But Yeshua said, I'm not Messiah. It's the one who sent me is the Messiah. And many of the crowd believed in him and said, when the Messiah comes, shall he do more signs than these which this one has done? So the crowd believes Yeshua that the Messiah sent him and that the Messiah will do more than him. When the Messiah comes, shall he do more signs than these which this one has done, or this one did. So then the Pharisees heard what the crowd was saying. They heard that this Yeshua had convinced the crowds that he was sent by the one who is the Messiah. And many of the crowds believed in him, that he was sent by the Messiah, and when the Messiah comes, he shall do even more signs. And when the Pharisees heard the crowd muttering these matters concerning him, and the Pharisees and the chief priests sent officers to seize him. Therefore Yeshua said, yet a little while I'm with you, then I will go to him who sent me. Who is the one who sent him? The Messiah. You shall seek me, and you shall not find me. And where I am, you are not able to come. The Yehudim therefore said to themselves, where is he about to go that we shall not find him? Is he about to go to the dispersion amongst the Greeks and to teach the Greeks? To teach them what? That the Messiah is coming. This is what he just got through saying to them. What is this word which he said, you shall seek me and shall not find me? Where I am, you are unable to come. This ends that discussion. On the last day, the great day of the festival, so Jesus is still there, and what is his final message? Anyone who thirsts, let him come. Let him who believes in me drink. What's the message he gives in this discord at Sukkot is that he is coming to pave the way for the Messiah. That when the Messiah comes, he shall even do greater things is the message that the people heard. Because they responded back and said, when the Messiah comes, shall he do more shall he do more signs than these which this one has done? So they understood it as being he's going to be even have more signs. That Yeshua was not the Messiah, but he was sent by the one who will be the Messiah. And that seems to be what Yeshua's response is. So when the crowd heard this, what'd they say? This is truly the prophet. Many from the crowd, what they heard him say, their response was, truly this is the prophet that paves the way, that leads the way, that makes the high places short. This is what's supposed to happen. There's going to be a king next. Why do you think there was such a big hoo-ha-ha for Bar Kokhba? Because if Jesus was the prophet, then Bar Kokhba was the Messiah, and he actually stood on the throne and minted coin and fought Rome and beat Rome for a couple years. Others said this is the Messiah. But then others said, does the Messiah come out of the Galil? Now that question comes up again in a minute. So many of the crowd said this is the prophet who brings the Messiah. The others said, no, this is the Messiah. But the others responded and said, but the Messiah doesn't come out of Galilee. This guy's the prophet. The Messiah doesn't come out of Galilee. This guy came out of Galilee. So we know where this one has come from. So you understand the textual criticism here. It says up front that we know where you have come from, but the one who is to come, we don't know where he's from. So many of the crowd said this is the prophet, but others said, no, he's saying he's the Messiah. But they responded and says, no, we know where the prophet comes from. We don't know where the Messiah comes from. That's what their response was. Does the scripture not say that he comes from the seed of David and from the village of Bethlehem where David was? So a division came about between the people because of him, because some thought he was the prophet and some thought he was a Messiah. Some of them wished to take him, but no one laid hands on him. The officers therefore came to the chief priests and the Pharisees and says, why did you not bring him? The officers answered and said, no one has ever spoken like this man. And the Pharisees therefore said, have you been led astray? Have any of the rulers of the Pharisees believed in him as well? You know, that kind of thing. But this crowd that does not know Torah, they have followed him, is accursed. They have followed him. So they want to know how high up the chain it goes, because these officers that came back, they're stunned by his words and they don't know what to think. So he is truly a force to be reckoned with from the religious political system, and they want to understand whether or not people understand him as the prophet or as the Messiah. So the Pharisees answered, who have you also been led astray? What? Prophet or Messiah? Have you also been led astray? What do they think it means? He's a prophet. Why? Because the Messiah doesn't come from the Galilee. They answered and said unto him, are you also from Galilee? Search and see that no prophet has risen out of Galilee. So the argument extends, that is described right here. The argument extends all the way up into the officers and the Pharisees identify that the crowd has chosen opposite of the Pharisees and the officers and the Sadducees. Nicodemus, who's the one who came to Yeshua by night, said to them, does our Torah judge a man unless it hears from him first and knows what he is doing? So he's saying we're supposed to listen to him first. We're supposed to judge by what we hear. And they responded and said, are you from also the Galilee? Search and see that no prophet is risen from the Galilee. So you see the animosity and the dichotomy between the two partitions exceeds all the way up into the Pharisees and the officers. But the crowd, depending on which way you rule this, the crowd is viewing it as he's the prophet, and the officers and the Pharisees are viewing it that he's the Messiah. And that seems to be what John 7 is identifying. So why did I bring this up as part of the discussion from Sukkot and the Tikva? Is because we see in the John narrative, which is not mentioned in the synoptic Matthew, Mark, Luke, because really it's just Mark. But we don't see this in that. We only see it in John, and it's interesting to see the author of John recording what the people thought was going on between the two parties, and what the people heard, and what he heard, and and how Yeshua responded, and how the Pharisees and the officers responded. And that historical insight is interesting because it shows the messianic expectations that were surrounding the period known as Sukkot. The beginning of the discussion, I pointed out how Sukkot began as a memorial for the children to remember their fathers and to teach their children after them, so that in the day when they are exiled and are kicked out of the land, that at some point in the future that there is a promise in place that the children, and not only the children, but also you in each generation, will be gathered back in that day. And that is the Tikva of Sukkot. What we see of Sukkot from the days of Solomon onward, we see that Sukkot has changed its meaning into a time where the king announces a major change. In the case of Solomon, the change from worshiping the way Moses said here at Shiloh to worshiping the way Solomon said or David said here in Jerusalem. And that we see the same thing happening again in Ezra's day, with no fulfillment of this messianic portion of a king standing up and proclaiming a deliverance or an action or a response from God that he somehow or another brings about through, again, Solomon, the gathering of the fire from heaven to burn the offering and the presence of God filling the temple. We don't see that with Ezra, and that begins this messianic expectation to fulfill what happened in the days of Solomon and before that in the days of Moses and had not been fulfilled. So when we get to the Ezraic period onward, we see a completely different understanding and a completely different context of Sukkot. And when Christianity today and even Judaism today looks back on the Maccabean era, the Bar Kokhba era, they look at expectations being very messianic, and they understand the importance of the gathering of the king. They look even now, Judaism looks even now for the day when Israel is restored, and that restoration is fulfilled by a king sitting on the throne. That it's a part of the process. It's not what they're looking for. It's just this. It just means that everything is done. When the king sits on the throne, peace is established, and that's what Judaism has as a messianic expectation. This is what these people in that day had a messianic expectation, because when the Messiah comes, he shall do more signs. Shall he do more signs than these? That they expected peace on the land, peace in Israel as a result of the Messiah coming, but that it would be the fulfillment of the regathering that in their eyes started in the days of Ezra when they came back from Babylon to complete the process that is still left open. Christianity looks at it as something completely different. The Messiah comes and it makes everything, establishes everything on that same day. Within the promises that we see within Moses and subsequently in Ezekiel and so forth, that the regathering of Israel has no messianic involvement whatsoever. You go look in, for example, Ezekiel 36. I like to go to quite a lot because it's quite granular in this subject. It looks like there's a period of time where God is agitated and Israel is populated by people that are causing it to be abominable or unclean, defiled. So this period of time, God is active but hasn't actually done the restoration and hasn't actually put the Spirit within Israel and hasn't actually gathered them back from the nation. So there's an aspect of God being involved even beforehand. But when we get to, I shall put my Spirit within you, this is before any messianic involvement. When we get to, not for your sake am I acting, but because of my name's sake, I will cleanse you from all your sins. No mention of anything messianic. When it talks about the expectations from the prophets before the exile, the expectation is that God will gather them back and put his Spirit within them without any messianic fulfillment whatsoever. The messianic fulfillment comes from when we get to the Isaiah, when we get into the time where Babylon is becoming a force to be reckoned with and an oppressor in Israel, those words now have meaning. But before that, there's no expectation of messianic fulfillment. So in the progression that Sukkot has taken over the years, I think what is important to us today is to remove everything that happened after Moses and just take it back to Moses and focus on what Moses said in his day. And that is that in that day shall all Israel, when these words come upon you, the blessing and the curse, so the good times and the bad times, which I have set before you, and you shall bring them back into your heart amongst the nations. So all the blessing and the curses have happened, and the ultimate curse is that you're sent out into the nations. So this is exile. And it shall be when you find yourself in exile, wherever God has driven you, You shall turn back to Yehovah your Elohim and to obey his voice according to all that I command you today, here today, Moses' words, Deuteronomy, with all of your heart and with all of your soul, both you and your children. Then Yehovah will gather back your captivity and shall have compassion on you and turn you back and gather you from all the peoples where Yehovah your Elohim has scattered you. Even if you're driven to the furthest most parts under the heaven, from there Yehovah your Elohim does gather you, and from there he does take you. And he shall bring you into the land which your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it. He shall do good to you, and increase you more than your fathers. He shall circumcise your heart and the heart of your seed, to love Yehovah your Elohim with all of your heart and with all of your being, which you might live. This is the promise that Sukkot means to me. That just as my fathers, the children who entered into the land after the exile of Kadesh Barnea, those who Moses spoke to in Deuteronomy, that just as he fulfilled the promise to them, that we can also look for the fulfilling of that promise in our day. Because it says, you and your children. You and your children. This is not just for the children. If it was just for the children, then you and I, at the end of our life, if it hadn't happened yet, we would be very sad for our life. But the promise is, you remember this festival, you remember this time, you remember what happened, you remember why they were sitting around in sukkahs, because they were in exile, and we still brought you in. That you, the children, the promise of the promise, you were still brought in, even when all of the previous generation lived their life in the wilderness in sukkahs. So we're to remember the time of Sukkot, of the time our fathers spent in exile, the time that our fathers lived outside of the promises of God because of their own stubbornness of heart, but that God fulfilled his promise by bringing in the children, and that in our day we, not only our children, but you and your children, generational, that there is a hope that Sukkot is the day when all the nations shall gather in peace with Israel at the feet of the blessings that God pours out from Israel. That's the hope. You can see in Psalm 27 that, this is one thing I ask of the Lord, and one thing do I desire, is to dwell in the house of Yehovah. That within this you see a person who is faithful in the beginning couple of verses. Where God is just, and God will stand up for us, and God will always fight our battles for us, and God will always make so many things blessed, and protect us and so forth. And then the next couple of verses is, why are you so far away from me? Why are my enemies so successful? We see faith wavering, and then ultimately we see that my hope isn't based upon the things I see. My hope is based upon the things that they've seen, or that has been seen. And our fathers before us have seen these things, and it's because of their hope and the hope that they have passed down to their children that I have hope today, and that you have hope today, that both you and your children I shall bring back, not only from all the nations where Yehovah your God has scattered you, but also in the farthest most parts under the heavens. Even from there, God will gather you and your children. That's my hope. Tikva, the hope. So for me, I hope that today's been an interesting discussion. And if there's any questions, I'll give you guys a few minutes to gather the questions up. I need a couple sips of water to wet the whistle. Good to see you, Wade. So while I'm letting the questions pile up, so I don't have any problem with constructive criticism on the YouTube page. There's been a comment that was posted just this past week on a previous discussion where I was probably quite animated, and the discussion was talking about some things that Christians believe, and I think I said something that upset them. I don't know what it was. That's why I'm saying it like that. I'm sure I said something that upset them. So they posted a complaint, and I posted a response, and I left it up. And I left it up so that you guys can see. I don't have a problem understanding that sometimes I'll say and do things that, aren't as scholarly or professional as one would hope from people who try to talk like I do. But hey, I'm just a hillbilly. I just clean up nice. So, looking for questions. But anyhow, I have no problem with that, with their complaint or comment or concern. Yeah. Yeah. It's with many words comes many opportunity to cause someone else to be upset. So when somebody talks as much as I do, you just kind of know that at some point somebody's going to take it for face value and not think about what I'm trying to say. Or I could just be plain, too juvenile at the moment. But I understand that I do that, and I'm working to change that. Isn't it great for those people who are all stuffy and everything like that? They never let you see their bad side and won't admit to a bad side because they don't want to show weakness. Ni importa. Okay, I don't see any other questions. Happy birthday, Wade. Or belated birthday. Hello to you guys up on the mesa. I assume you guys are getting cold at night now? So the people on the video are like, okay, is this done? Yeah, this is done. I'm just waiting to see if there's any questions, because sometimes there's a question that probably should be asked, and sometimes there's not. I see lots of comments, but I don't see any questions, so just another minute, and we'll close it down. There was a comment just the other day on somebody made about, if I'm wrong, then the Bible is wrong. And I didn't say that. It was something that was said. If I'm wrong, then the Bible is wrong. That's what I would call something that is akin to Gnosticism. Not Gnosticism of the first century, heretics or whatever. But Gnosticism from the perspective of having a certitude that you know what you know, and what you know is what you know, and God believes what you know to be true as well, and that you know that God does, and there's a lot of you know in that. No, ni importa. Habla aquí en español de Costa Rica es ni importa. Pero no importa sí también, pero ella dice ni. Muchas veces es no hay ni. No hay ni importa. No hay ni grave. Sorry. What in the world was I saying? Okay, so when we talk about these texts, there's so many reasons to have low certitude on some texts and high certitude on other texts, which is one of the reasons I hold Deuteronomy to the position I do, is because is reasonable to assume a very high level of certitude that the words of Deuteronomy, at least most of the words of Deuteronomy, relay the meat and potatoes, the lowest common denominator in order for us to achieve what this outcome is. But the idea that the outcome is the restoration of not just the children, but also the adults, also those who were standing before them today and not standing before them today, that it was for all of them temporal, not temporal, but generational. that I think is something that is embedded throughout the entire document, and I think something like that would be hard to manipulate just by changing a single word or adding a single story. So that's one of the things that I personally choose when I do a grammatical search of the text, is things have to follow a certain flow. Oh yeah, no worries. Oh, you hadn't heard this? What I was talking about today? You haven't heard that? Well, it's sometimes what I say is not heard by you, but others have heard it. Many times I'll find that stuff I come up with is stuff that even Ezra or Rambam, that they've also talked about. So I'm not coming up with anything new. Sometimes it's just those positions are just tucked away in the fabric of time, because other positions are more favorable to the ruling party. That happens in politics too, right? Okay, so I don't see any other questions or comments. I'm going to go ahead and let you guys go. I want to thank you so much for spending time, and thank you guys for overlooking my faults and failures in being a presenter. But I definitely enjoy doing this, so hope you guys enjoy listening. So Shabbat Shalom, Shalom Aleichem, Hag Sameach, Hag Tikva, because the future is bright, and we should probably be wearing shades. Hasta luego.